Sarah Martinez had always been different from other girls in her small Texas town. While her classmates spent weekends at the mall or gossiping about boys, she was running 10 miles before sunrise or doing pull-ups in her backyard. Her father, a retired Marine, had taught her that strength wasn't just about muscles. It was about never giving up, no matter how impossible things seemed. Growing up, Sarah faced constant doubt from everyone around her. Teachers would shake their heads when she talked about joining the military. Her guidance counselor suggested she consider nursing or teaching instead. Even her own mother worried that her daughter was setting herself up for disappointment by chasing dreams that seemed too big for someone her size. Sarah stood barely 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighed only 125 pounds soaking wet. When she walked into the military recruitment office at 18, the sergeant behind the desk looked her up and down with obvious skepticism. He shuffled through pamphlets about administrative roles and medical corps positions, assuming she would want something safe and traditional. "I want to be infantry," Sarah told him firmly, her voice steady despite the nervous energy coursing through her veins. The recruiter's eyebrows shot up, and he spent the next hour explaining why that might not be the best fit for someone like her. He talked about the physical demands, the combat situations, and the reality that very few women had successfully completed infantry training. But Sarah had made up her mind years ago. She had watched her father's old war documentaries, read every military biography she could get her hands on, and trained her body like a machine. She knew exactly what she was getting into, and she refused to let anyone talk her out of it. Basic training was everything the recruiter had warned her about, and worse. From day one, the drill sergeants singled her out, not because they wanted her to fail, but because they needed to know if she could handle the pressure that would come later. They watched every move she made, scrutinized every exercise, and pushed her harder than many of the male recruits. During the first week, Sarah struggled with some of the strength-based challenges. While she could run circles around most of her fellow trainees, the heavy lifting and equipment carrying proved more difficult. She watched as bigger, stronger recruits completed tasks that left her muscles screaming and her lungs burning. Other recruits began to whisper among themselves. Some questioned why the military was lowering standards to accommodate women. Others made jokes about her size, calling her names like Tiny and Mouse. The comments stung, but Sarah used them as fuel for her determination. She started waking up an hour before reveille to do extra training. While everyone else slept, she practiced carrying heavy packs, did additional strength exercises, and worked on technique to make up for what she lacked in raw power. Her hands became calloused and raw. Her muscles ached constantly, but she refused to complain or show weakness. The drill sergeants noticed her extra effort, though they never said anything directly. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, a tough woman who had served 3 combat tours, would occasionally offer subtle corrections to Sarah's form or suggest different approaches to challenging exercises. She never made it obvious, but Sarah understood that she was being quietly supported by someone who had walked this path before. 3 weeks into basic training, Sarah faced her biggest challenge yet. The company was required to complete a 12-mile march carrying full combat gear weighing over 60 pounds. The route included steep hills, rocky terrain, and had to be completed within a specific time limit. Failure meant recycling to start training over again. The night before the march, Sarah lay awake staring at the ceiling of the barracks. She could hear the steady breathing of her sleeping teammates around her, but sleep wouldn't come. She ran through the route in her mind, calculating how fast she would need to move to stay within the time limit, while carrying gear that weighed nearly half her body weight. When morning came, Sarah strapped on her equipment with hands that shook slightly from nerves and adrenaline. The pack felt impossibly heavy, and she wondered if she had finally found the limit of what her small frame could handle. Around her, larger male recruits seemed to wear their gear with ease, chatting casually as they prepared for what they considered a routine challenge. The march began before dawn, with the company moving out in formation under a star-filled sky. For the first few miles, Sarah managed to keep pace with the group, though she could feel the weight of the pack digging into her shoulders and hips. Her breathing was already labored while others seemed barely affected by the load. As the sun rose and the terrain became more challenging, Sarah began to fall behind. The pack felt heavier with each step, and her legs started to feel like they were made of concrete. She watched as recruit after recruit passed her, some offering encouragement, but others shaking their heads in disappointment. By mile 8, Sarah was struggling seriously. Her pace had slowed to barely more than a walk, and she could see the last of the main group disappearing around a bend ahead of her. Behind her, she could hear the drill sergeants in a vehicle, following to pick up anyone who couldn't complete the march. This was the moment she had feared since day one. The moment when her body would give out and prove all the doubters right. She thought about her father, about all the people back home who had told her she wasn't cut out for this life. She thought about the recruiter who had tried to steer her toward a desk job. But then, she thought about Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, who had never said the words but whose actions showed she believed Sarah belonged here. She thought about the other women who had come before her, who had faced these same challenges and somehow found a way through. Sarah stopped walking and stood still in the middle of the trail for a moment. She took several deep breaths, adjusted her pack straps, and made a decision that would define the rest of her military career. Instead of waiting for the vehicle to pick her up, she started running. Her legs protested immediately, and the pack bounced painfully against her back, but she ignored the discomfort and focused on moving forward. She had 4 miles left and limited time to complete them. Every step was a choice between giving up and pushing through pain that seemed to increase exponentially. The trail wound through dense forest and up increasingly steep hills. Sarah's lungs burned as she fought to maintain her pace, and sweat poured down her face despite the cool morning air. Her pack straps had rubbed her shoulders raw, and she could feel blisters forming on her feet, but she kept moving. Mile 9 passed in a blur of determination and agony. Sarah had caught sight of a few stragglers from the main group ahead of her, which gave her a target to focus on. She concentrated on closing the distance between herself and those recruits, using them as motivation to keep her legs moving when they wanted to give out. By mile 10, something remarkable was happening. The pain in Sarah's legs and back hadn't decreased, but her mind had somehow separated from the physical discomfort. She found a rhythm in her breathing and her steps, and entered what athletes call the zone, a state where the body continues performing while the conscious mind almost detaches from the struggle. She began passing other recruits who had started strong, but were now paying the price for going out too fast. Some were walking slowly. Others had stopped altogether to rest. Sarah nodded to each of them as she passed, offering quiet words of encouragement even though she barely had breath to spare. With 2 miles remaining, Sarah caught up to the main group of recruits. Many of them looked surprised to see her, having assumed she had dropped out miles earlier. A few offered impressed nods of respect, while others seemed annoyed that someone they considered weaker had managed to catch up. Sarah didn't have energy to worry about their reactions. She was running on pure determination now, her body operating on autopilot, while her mind focused solely on reaching the finish line within the time limit. Every step was a victory over the voices that had told her she didn't belong here. The final mile was the longest of Sarah's life. Her entire body screamed in protest, and she could taste blood in her mouth from pushing herself so hard. But she could see the finish line in the distance, and she knew that crossing it would mean more than just completing a training exercise. It would prove that she belonged in this world. As Sarah approached the final 100 yards, she could see Staff Sergeant Rodriguez standing near the finish line with a stopwatch. Their eyes met for just a moment, and Sarah saw something that looked like pride in the drill sergeant's expression. It was the first time anyone in authority had looked at her like she might actually make it through
We need to
training.
move now before
Sarah
it's too
crossed the
late.
finish line with 3 minutes to spare. She immediately collapsed to her knees, unable to stand under the weight of her pack any longer. Her hands shook uncontrollably, and she couldn't catch her breath, but she had done it. She had completed the march that everyone expected her to fail. Other recruits who had finished ahead of her came over to help her up and remove her pack. For the first time since training began, Sarah felt like she was truly part of the team rather than an outsider trying to prove she belonged. The respect in their eyes was something she had never experienced before. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez approached as Sarah was getting back to her feet. "Good work, Martinez," she said simply, but the words carried weight that went far beyond the simple phrase. It was acknowledgement that Sarah had earned her place here through effort and determination rather than lowered standards or special treatment. That night in the barracks, the atmosphere around Sarah was different. Recruits who had barely spoken to her before now included her in conversations and asked for advice about upcoming challenges. The nicknames like Tiny and Mouse disappeared, replaced by her actual name and genuine respect. But Sarah knew this was just the beginning. Basic training was only the first step in a journey that would test her in ways she couldn't yet imagine. The doubters back home still thought she would wash out eventually. The military system still questioned whether women could handle certain roles. And Sarah herself still had moments of doubt about whether she was strong enough for what lay ahead. However, something fundamental had changed during that 12-mile march. Sarah had discovered a kind of strength that had nothing to do with physical size or muscle mass. She had found the ability to push through barriers that seemed impossible and to perform when everything in her body and mind told her to quit. As she lay in her bunk that night, Sarah's body ached in places she didn't know could hurt. But she also felt a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. She had proven to herself and others that determination could overcome physical limitations, and that the mind was often the strongest muscle in the human body. The path ahead would be long and difficult. Infantry training after basic would bring new challenges and new opportunities for people to doubt her abilities. But Sarah now knew something that her critics didn't. She had already survived the moment when giving up would have been easiest, and she had chosen to keep fighting instead. This realization would carry her through everything that came next, including encounters with some of the most elite soldiers in the world who would test her in ways she never imagined possible. But that night, Sarah Martinez went to sleep knowing she had taken the first crucial step toward proving that strength comes in many different forms. 3 years after that grueling march in basic training, Sarah Martinez stood at the gates of Fort Bragg, North Carolina, home to some of the most elite military units in the world. She had successfully completed infantry training, served a deployment overseas, and earned the respect of her fellow soldiers through consistent performance and unwavering dedication. Now she faced her biggest challenge yet, selection for the Army's most demanding Special Operations Program. Colonel James Mitchell had seen thousands of soldiers come through Special Operations selection over his 25-year career. As the commanding officer overseeing the selection process, he had developed an eye for identifying which candidates had the mental and physical tools necessary to succeed in the most challenging environments the military could offer. When Colonel Mitchell first saw Sarah's file cross his desk, he experienced the same skepticism that had followed her throughout her career. Her physical statistics hadn't changed much since basic training. She was still small by military standards, still lighter than most of the equipment she would be required to carry in special operations missions. But her service record told a different story. Sarah had consistently outperformed expectations in every assignment. She had volunteered for the most difficult missions during her deployment, had earned commendations for her performance under fire, and had gained a reputation among her peers as someone who could be counted on when situations became desperate. The selection process that Sarah was about to enter had a failure rate of over 80%. It was designed to break down candidates physically and mentally to identify the small percentage of soldiers who could operate effectively under extreme stress and in impossible conditions. Many of the men who attempted selection were larger, stronger, and more physically imposing than Sarah, yet most of them would fail. Colonel Mitchell decided to personally observe Sarah's progress through selection. He wanted to see for himself whether the small soldier from Texas had what it took to join the ranks of America's most elite warriors, or whether her previous successes had been exceptions rather than the rule. The first phase of selection focused on basic physical fitness, but at a level that far exceeded normal military standards. Candidates were required to complete obstacle courses with heavy equipment, navigate long-distance movements with minimal rest, and demonstrate proficiency with advanced weapon systems under time pressure. From his observation position, Colonel Mitchell watched as Sarah approached each challenge with the same methodical preparation she had developed over her years of service. While other candidates relied on brute strength to power through obstacles, Sarah studied each challenge carefully, looking for techniques and approaches that would allow her to succeed despite her physical limitations. During the first obstacle course, Sarah watched several larger candidates attack a wall-climbing exercise by simply overpowering it, using their arm strength to muscle their way to the top. When her turn came, Sarah used her legs more effectively, found better hand and foot holds, and completed the obstacle faster than many of the candidates who appeared more physically capable. Colonel Mitchell made notes in his observation log, documenting not just Sarah's times and completion rates, but also her problem-solving approach and adaptation techniques. He began to see patterns in her performance that reminded him of some of the most successful special operations soldiers he had known. Those who succeeded not because they were the strongest or fastest, but because they were the smartest and most determined. The second week of selection introduced sleep deprivation and increased psychological pressure. Candidates were required to operate on minimal rest while completing complex tasks that demanded both physical performance and mental acuity. This was where many strong candidates began to break down, as their bodies could no longer compensate for the accumulated fatigue and stress. Sarah's performance during this phase surprised even Colonel Mitchell. While her physical capabilities remained consistent, her mental sharpness seemed to actually improve under pressure. She made fewer mistakes than many of her fellow candidates, maintained better situational awareness, and continued to find innovative solutions to the challenges presented to her. During one particularly difficult exercise, candidates were required to navigate a 12-hour mission simulation with minimal equipment and strict time constraints. They had to move through difficult terrain, complete various tasks at checkpoint stations, and maintain communications protocols throughout the exercise. Colonel Mitchell followed the exercise from the command center, tracking each candidate's progress through GPS monitors and radio communications. As the hours passed, he watched as candidate after candidate began to struggle with the physical demands and mental complexity of the scenario. Sarah had started the exercise in the middle of the pack, neither leading nor falling behind. But as the mission progressed and other candidates began to falter, her steady pace and consistent performance began to stand out. While others took longer breaks or made mistakes that required backtracking, Sarah maintained her rhythm and avoided errors that cost valuable time. By the 10-hour mark, Sarah had moved into the top third of remaining candidates. More importantly, radio communications indicated that she was maintaining clear thinking and good decision-making despite the accumulated fatigue and stress. Colonel Mitchell noted that her voice over the radio remained calm and professional, even when reporting difficulties or requesting clarification on mission parameters. The final phase of the exercise required candidates to complete a complex problem-solving task while physically exhausted. They were presented with a scenario that had no obvious solution and were required to develop and implement a plan within a limited time frame. Colonel Mitchell observed as Sarah approached this challenge with the same methodical thinking she had applied throughout selection. She took a few minutes to analyze the problem, identified the key constraints and objectives, and developed a plan that was both creative and practical. Her solution wasn't the fastest or the most spectacular, but it was effective and demonstrated the kind of tactical thinking that special operations missions demanded. When other candidates became frustrated with the complexity of the problem and began to rush their decisions, Sarah maintained her composure and worked through the challenge systematically. As selection moved into its third week, the psychological pressure intensified significantly. Candidates faced scenarios designed to test their ability to operate under extreme stress, make decisions with incomplete information, and maintain performance when everything seemed to be going wrong. This phase historically eliminated many candidates who had performed well in the physical challenges but couldn't handle the mental demands of special operations work. Colonel Mitchell paid particular attention to how each candidate responded to failure, criticism, and unexpected changes in mission parameters. Sarah faced her most difficult moment during a leadership exercise where she was required to guide a team through a complex scenario with multiple competing objectives. As the designated leader, she would be held responsible for her team's success or failure, and the exercise was designed to present situations where failure was almost inevitable. The scenario began to go wrong almost immediately. Equipment malfunctions, changing weather conditions, and unexpected complications created a cascade of problems that would have challenged even experienced special operations leaders. Sarah's team looked to her for guidance as the situation deteriorated rapidly. Colonel Mitchell watched as Sarah demonstrated the leadership qualities that couldn't be taught or measured through physical tests. Instead of panicking or becoming paralyzed by the complexity of the situation, she prioritized the most critical objectives, communicated clearly with her team members, and adapted her plan as new problems arose. When a team member was injured during the exercise, Sarah made the difficult decision to alter the mission plan to ensure the safety of her soldier. This decision cost valuable time and made achieving the original objectives nearly impossible, but it demonstrated the kind of judgment that special operations commanders valued above raw performance metrics. The exercise ended with Sarah's team failing to complete their assigned mission within the time limit. According to the strict scoring criteria, this constituted a failure that could result in elimination from selection. However, Colonel Mitchell noted that Sarah had successfully managed a crisis situation, maintained team cohesion under pressure, and made ethically sound decisions when faced with competing priorities. During the after-action review, Sarah was criticized heavily by the instructor cadre for her team's failure to complete the mission. The criticism was intentionally harsh and personal, designed to test whether candidates could handle feedback and maintain their composure under verbal assault. Sarah listened to the criticism without becoming defensive or making excuses. She acknowledged the areas where her leadership could have been better, accepted responsibility for her team's performance, and demonstrated that she could learn from failure without being destroyed by it. Colonel Mitchell made extensive notes about this interaction. In his experience, the ability to handle criticism and learn from failure was one of the most important predictors of success in special operations. Soldiers who became defensive or made excuses rarely succeeded in environments where honest self-assessment and continuous improvement were essential for survival. As selection entered its final phase, only 30% of the original candidates remained. The survivors included Sarah and a group of soldiers who had proven themselves capable of operating at the highest levels under the most challenging conditions. The final tests were designed to push candidates to their absolute limits in every dimension: physical, mental, and emotional. These exercises simulated the kind of extreme conditions that special operations soldiers might face in real combat situations, where failure could mean death for themselves and their teammates. Colonel Mitchell arranged to personally observe the final exercise, a 72-hour mission simulation that would test everything the candidates had learned throughout selection. The scenario was based on real special operations missions and required participants to demonstrate mastery of all the skills they would need as elite soldiers. Sarah entered the final exercise knowing that her performance over the next 3 days would determine whether months of preparation and weeks of selection would culminate in success or failure. The exhaustion and stress of the previous weeks had taken their toll, but she drew on the same mental strength that had carried her through every challenge since basic training. The mission began with a night infiltration exercise that required candidates to navigate difficult terrain in complete darkness while carrying full equipment loads. Sarah's small size, which had been viewed as a disadvantage throughout her career, actually proved beneficial in this environment as she could move more quietly and conceal herself more effectively than larger candidates. As the exercise progressed through multiple phases, Sarah continued to demonstrate the consistency and reliability that had impressed Colonel Mitchell throughout selection. She didn't always perform the best on individual tasks, but she never failed completely, and her overall performance remained strong across all areas. On the second day of the exercise, candidates faced their most challenging test yet, a rescue scenario where they had to extract wounded teammates from a hostile environment while under simulated enemy fire. The exercise required perfect coordination, split-second decision-making, and the physical capability to carry wounded soldiers to safety. When Sarah's turn came to lead a rescue team, she found herself facing the kind of situation that had always been used as an argument against women in combat roles. She needed to physically carry a wounded soldier who outweighed her by more than 50 pounds across difficult terrain while under enemy fire. Colonel Mitchell watched intently as Sarah assessed the situation and developed her approach. Instead of trying to carry the wounded soldier in the traditional manner, which would have been impossible given their size difference, she improvised a technique that allowed her to move the casualty effectively while maintaining her mobility and defensive capabilities. Her solution wasn't textbook perfect, but it was practical and effective. More importantly, it demonstrated the kind of adaptive thinking and problem-solving ability that special operations missions demanded. Sarah had once again found a way to overcome physical limitations through superior preparation and creative thinking. The final day of selection tested candidates' ability to maintain performance while operating in a state of extreme exhaustion. After minimal sleep and constant physical and mental challenges, the survivors had to complete a series of tasks that required precision, judgment, and teamwork. Sarah's performance during this final phase was perhaps her most impressive of the entire selection process. While other candidates showed signs of breaking down under the accumulated stress and fatigue, she seemed to find an extra reserve of determination and focus. Colonel Mitchell realized that he was witnessing something rare, a soldier who actually performed better under extreme pressure rather than merely surviving it. Sarah's calm demeanor and consistent performance in the most challenging conditions demonstrated the qualities that separated special operations soldiers from conventional forces. When selection finally ended, Colonel Mitchell faced the decision that would determine whether Sarah Martinez would join the ranks of America's most elite soldiers. Her scores and performance metrics told a clear story of success, but he also had to consider the broader implications of his recommendation. As he reviewed his extensive notes from 3 weeks of observation, Colonel Mitchell found himself reflecting on his own assumptions and biases. He had begun the process expecting Sarah to fail, or at best to barely qualify for selection. Instead, he had witnessed a soldier who not only met the standards but had demonstrated qualities that many of her male counterparts lacked. The recommendation that Colonel Mitchell submitted that evening would change Sarah's life forever, but it would also begin a chain of events that would challenge some of the most elite soldiers in the world and force everyone involved to reconsider their assumptions about strength, capability, and what it meant to be a warrior in the modern military. 6 months after Colonel Mitchell's recommendation secured her place in special operations, Sarah Martinez found herself standing on the tarmac of a classified military installation, watching as a group of Navy SEALs emerged from their transport aircraft. She had been assigned to a joint training exercise that would bring together elite soldiers from different branches of the military to test new tactical procedures and equipment. The SEALs who walked across the tarmac that morning represented everything that popular culture associated with elite military forces. They were tall, muscular, and carried themselves with the confidence that came from years of the most challenging training the military could provide. Their reputation preceded them. These were men who had operated in the most dangerous environments in the world and had succeeded where others failed. Lieutenant Commander Jake Stevens led the SEAL team, a decorated veteran with over a decade of special operations experience. When he was briefed about the joint exercise, he had been told that an Army Special Operations soldier would be attached to his team for the duration of the training. What he hadn't been told was that this soldier would be a woman who weighed less than most of the equipment his team carried on missions. The initial meeting between Sarah and the SEAL team was polite but tense. Stevens and his men had worked exclusively with other male special operations soldiers throughout their careers, and they weren't sure how to integrate someone they perceived as fundamentally different from themselves. "So you're our Army attachment," Stevens said as he looked Sarah up and down with obvious skepticism. "I have to ask, are you sure you're in the right place? This isn't exactly a standard training exercise." Sarah had heard variations of this question countless times throughout her career, but coming from someone of Stevens' reputation, it stung more than usual. She maintained her composure and responded professionally, but she could see in the SEALs' faces that they had already made up their minds about her capabilities. The training exercise was designed to test small unit tactics in a simulated hostile environment. Teams would be required to complete a series of missions over 5 days, with each mission building in complexity and difficulty. The scenarios were based on real special operations missions and would test every skill that elite soldiers were expected to master. On the first day, The exercise focused on reconnaissance and surveillance operations. Teams were required to infiltrate designated areas, gather intelligence on simulated enemy positions, and report their findings without being detected. Success depended on stealth, patience, and the ability to remain motionless for hours while maintaining vigilance. Stevens assigned Sarah to work with Petty Officer First Class Mike Rodriguez, one of his most experienced operators. Rodriguez had initially resisted the assignment, preferring to work with teammates he had trained with for years, but Stevens wanted to see how the team dynamics would work with their new addition. The mission began before dawn, with Sarah and Rodriguez moving through dense forest toward their observation position. Rodriguez set a challenging pace, partly to test Sarah's ability to keep up, and partly because he wanted to complete the mission quickly and return to more familiar team configurations. Sarah matched Rodriguez's pace easily, moving through the forest with the quiet efficiency she had developed during her years of training. More importantly, she began pointing out terrain features and potential security threats that Rodriguez had missed in his eagerness to reach their destination quickly. When they reached their observation position, Rodriguez was surprised to discover that Sarah's fieldcraft skills were exceptional. She helped establish a concealed position that provided excellent visibility while minimizing their exposure to detection. Her attention to detail and understanding of camouflage techniques impressed Rodriguez, though he was reluctant to admit it. During the 12-hour surveillance mission, Sarah demonstrated the kind of patience and focus that reconnaissance operations demanded. She maintained constant vigilance, accurately identified and cataloged enemy positions, and provided detailed intelligence reports that exceeded the mission requirements. Rodriguez found himself gradually revising his opinion of his new partner. While he had expected to spend the mission compensating for Sarah's perceived weaknesses, he instead discovered that her observational skills and tactical knowledge were superior to many of the SEALs he had worked with previously. When they returned from the mission, Rodriguez's report to Stevens was cautiously positive. "She kept up," he said simply. But Stevens could tell from his tone that there was more to the story than Rodriguez was willing to admit in front of the rest of the team. The second day of the exercise focused on direct action missions, high-intensity operations that required teams to assault enemy positions with speed and violence. These missions played to the traditional strengths of Special Operations Forces and were exactly the kind of scenario where Sarah's critics expected her to struggle. Stevens decided to include Sarah in the main assault team, partially to test her capabilities and partially because he wanted to see how she would perform under the most challenging conditions. The mission required the team to breach a fortified position, neutralize simulated enemies, and secure valuable intelligence before withdrawing under enemy pressure. The assault began with a coordinated approach that required perfect timing and communication between team members. Sarah was assigned to provide covering fire while the entry team breached the main door of the target building. Her role was critical. Any failure in suppressive fire could result in casualties among the assault team. As the mission commenced, Sarah demonstrated her marksmanship skills with a precision that surprised even Stevens. Her shots were accurate and well-timed, creating the suppressive effect that allowed the entry team to reach their objective safely. More importantly, she maintained her composure under the simulated enemy fire and communicated effectively with her teammates throughout the assault. When the entry team encountered unexpected resistance inside the building, Sarah made a split-second decision that would define her relationship with the SEAL team for the remainder of the exercise. Without waiting for orders, she repositioned herself to provide better fire support and called out enemy positions that the assault team couldn't see from their location. Her actions allowed the team to overcome the resistance and complete their mission successfully. More importantly, her initiative and tactical awareness demonstrated that she wasn't just keeping up with the team. She was actively contributing to their success in ways that went beyond basic competency. After the mission, Stevens gathered his team for the standard after-action review. The discussion of tactics and performance was more positive than he had expected, with several team members acknowledging Sarah's contributions to the mission's success. Petty Officer Rodriguez was particularly vocal in his praise. "She saved our asses in there," he told Stevens bluntly. "Her position gave us the fire support we needed when things went sideways, and Her calls on enemy positions were spot on. Stevens found himself reassessing his initial assumptions about Sarah's capabilities. While she clearly approached problems differently than his male teammates, her results spoke for themselves. She was proving to be not just competent, but genuinely valuable to the team's performance. The third day of the exercise introduced the element that would become Sarah's defining moment with the SEAL team, a combat casualty scenario that tested each soldier's ability to perform under the most stressful conditions imaginable. The mission began as a standard patrol operation, but quickly escalated when the team encountered a complex ambush scenario. The exercise was designed to simulate the chaos and confusion of real combat, with multiple threats, changing objectives, and unexpected complications that required immediate adaptation. Sarah was operating as part of a four-person team when the ambush began. The scenario called for one team member to be designated as a casualty, simulating a serious wound that would require immediate medical attention and evacuation. The role of the wounded soldier was assigned to Petty Officer First Class Tom Bradley, a 6'2", 200-pound operator who represented exactly the kind of casualty evacuation challenge that critics claimed women couldn't handle. When Bradley went down with his simulated wound, the team found itself in an impossible situation. They were under heavy simulated enemy fire, had limited time before reinforcements would arrive, and needed to move their wounded teammate to safety across several hundred yards of open terrain. Stevens, who was monitoring the exercise from the command center, watched with intense interest as Sarah and her teammates assessed their situation. This was the moment that would either validate or destroy every argument about women in combat roles. The scenario was designed to be nearly impossible, but it reflected the kind of situation that special operations soldiers might face in real combat. Sarah took charge of the casualty evacuation with an authority that surprised her teammates. Instead of attempting to carry Bradley in the traditional manner, which would have been impossible given their size difference, she quickly assessed the available equipment and terrain to develop an alternative approach. Using a combination of tactical carry techniques and improvised equipment, Sarah created a system that allowed her to move Bradley effectively while maintaining her ability to return fire if necessary. Her solution required more time to implement than a traditional carry, but it was practical and sustainable over the distance required. As the team began moving toward their extraction point, Sarah demonstrated the same mental toughness that had carried her through every previous challenge. Despite the physical strain of moving a casualty who outweighed her significantly, she maintained her tactical awareness and continued to function as an effective team member. Halfway to the extraction point, the exercise scenario introduced a new complication: additional enemy contact that required the team to take cover and return fire while protecting their wounded teammate. This was the kind of complex, multidimensional challenge that separated elite soldiers from conventional forces. Sarah positioned Bradley in the best available cover and then immediately moved to establish a firing position that would allow her to protect the casualty while engaging the simulated enemy forces. Her actions were instinctive and professional, demonstrating that her casualty evacuation efforts hadn't compromised her ability to fight effectively. The firefight that followed tested every skill that Sarah had developed throughout her career. She had to maintain accurate fire while constantly monitoring Bradley's condition and coordinating with her teammates to develop a plan for continuing the evacuation. Stevens watched from the command center as Sarah orchestrated the team's response to the complex scenario. Her radio communications were clear and professional, her tactical decisions were sound, and her execution was flawless. More importantly, she was clearly the leader in this situation, with her more experienced SEAL teammates following her guidance without question. When the immediate threat had been neutralized, Sarah reorganized the team for the final push to the extraction point. Bradley's simulated condition had deteriorated during the firefight, adding urgency to an already challenging situation. The final phase of the evacuation required the team to move through difficult terrain while maintaining security and monitoring their casualties' condition. Sarah adapted her evacuation technique to the changing terrain, demonstrating the kind of flexibility and problem-solving ability that special operations missions demanded. As they approached the extraction point, Sarah coordinated with the helicopter crew to ensure a smooth handoff of the casualty. Her communication was precise and professional, providing the medical team with the information they needed to continue Bradley's care. When the exercise ended and Bradley was safely aboard the evacuation helicopter, Sarah's teammates gathered around her with expressions of genuine respect and admiration. These were men who had never worked with a woman in a combat role, yet they had just witnessed a performance that exceeded their highest expectations. Petty Officer Rodriguez spoke for the entire team when he told Sarah, "I've been doing this for 15 years, and I've never seen anyone handle a casualty evacuation better than what you just did. You saved Bradley's life and kept the rest of us alive while doing it." Stevens approached Sarah after the exercise with a completely different attitude than he had displayed during their first meeting. "I owe you an apology," he said simply. "I made assumptions about your capabilities based on factors that don't matter. What I saw today was a special operations soldier performing at the highest level." The remaining 2 days of the exercise continued to reinforce the new dynamic between Sarah and the SEAL team. Rather than being treated as a liability or a token addition, she was fully integrated into the team as a valuable contributor whose skills complemented and enhanced their collective capabilities. During the final mission, a complex multi-phase operation that tested every skill the teams had practiced throughout the week, Sarah was assigned a leadership role for one of the assault elements. Stevens made this decision based purely on her performance throughout the exercise, recognizing that she had earned the position through demonstrated competence rather than political considerations. The mission was the most challenging of the entire exercise, requiring coordination between multiple teams, perfect timing, and flawless execution under pressure. Sarah's element was responsible for securing a critical objective that would determine the success or failure of the entire operation. As Sarah led her team through the mission, Stevens observed from the command center with growing amazement. The small soldier from Texas who had been greeted with skepticism just 5 days earlier was now commanding a team of elite SEALs with natural authority and tactical brilliance. Her team completed their objective ahead of schedule and below budget in military terms. More importantly, they did so with a level of precision and professionalism that impressed even the exercise controllers who had designed the scenarios to be nearly impossible. When the exercise concluded, Stevens gathered both teams for a final debrief. Instead of the polite but distant farewell that Sarah had expected, she found herself being invited to join the SEALs for their traditional post-exercise celebration. As the evening progressed, Sarah found herself accepted not as a curiosity or an experiment, but as a colleague and fellow warrior. The SEALs shared stories of their most challenging missions and asked for her perspectives on tactics and techniques. Petty Officer Bradley, who had played the casualty in the evacuation exercise, made a toast that summarized the transformation that had occurred over the 5-day period. "To Sarah Martinez," he said, raising his beer, "who proved that strength isn't measured in pounds or inches, but in heart and determination." The applause that followed was genuine and heartfelt, representing a complete transformation in how these elite soldiers viewed not just Sarah, but the broader question of women in combat roles. They had witnessed firsthand that capability and courage transcended traditional assumptions about gender and physical size. As Sarah prepared to return to her own unit the following morning, Stevens approached her with an unexpected offer. "My team has a deployment coming up in 6 months," he told her. "We could use someone with your skills and leadership ability. Would you be interested in a permanent assignment?" The offer represented everything Sarah had worked toward throughout her career: full acceptance and integration into the most elite levels of the military. But, more importantly, it represented vindication for every woman who had been told she wasn't strong enough, fast enough, or tough enough to serve in combat roles. Sarah's response was immediate and confident. "I'd be honored to serve with your team, sir." As she spoke these words, she thought about the long journey that had brought her to this moment, from the small Texas town where teachers had doubted her dreams, through the grueling challenges of basic training, and ultimately to this moment of complete acceptance by America's most elite warriors. The story of Sarah Martinez had become more than just one woman's journey to prove herself in a male-dominated profession. It had become a testament to the power of determination, the importance of judging people by their actions rather than their appearance, and the reality that strength comes in many different forms. Colonel Mitchell, who had recommended Sarah for Special Operations Selection, would later write in his assessment that her performance with the SEAL team represented a turning point in how the military understood capability and leadership. Her success had opened doors not just for herself, but for countless other women who would follow in her footsteps. Years later, when Sarah reflected on that week with the SEAL team, she realized that it represented the moment when she stopped trying to prove that she belonged and simply began belonging. The doubters would always exist, but they could no longer argue with results that spoke louder than any criticism or prejudice. Sarah Martinez had risen above the SEALs not by being like them, but by being the best version of herself. In doing so, she had proven that excellence knows no gender, and that the heart of a warrior beats just as strongly in a 125-pound woman from Texas as it does in anyone else who chooses to serve their country at the highest level.